Most of you will know who Emma Hurst is. Okay, she's a New South Wales parliamentarian for the Animal Justice Party, and we have a panel here that we're going to ask various questions, and Emma has quite graciously come and allowed us to ask her those questions. And what we're going to do is focus on the recording so that we can segment it and we can upload it so that people can view it in a later point. So I'm hoping some of your background will also come out through the questions that we ask. So I'll just go straight into the questions, if I may. Sure. Is that all right? The first question is an easy one, and it's really just asking Emma to explain a little bit about how she got into the Animal Justice Party and what motivates her to stay.
Thank you. My involvement in animal protection probably started when I was a very young child. I remember actually holding a hen in my arms, and the hen was purring. And I remember thinking as a young child that this hen shows joy the same way as my cat at home shows joy. We had 3 rescue cats at home. And I remember going home and writing letters to my parents and just saying, you know, I didn't want to eat animals anymore, and I didn't want, if I can't eat my cat, then I can't eat this hen. And my parents at the time said, no, that's fine, you've just got to start eating vegetables, which didn't happen. I didn't eat vegetables either. But, I had sort of had that sort of moment quite early, but it was many years later that somebody simply handed me a flyer on the street, and I went online and started researching and found out that calves were taken from their mothers in the dairy industry, that day-old male chicks were macerated in the egg industry because they weren't going to lay eggs. And it was really like a light bulb moment. And at the time, I had actually been studying education at university, and so I switched to psychology because I knew that animal cruelty was human caused, and so we actually needed a human-focused solution. We're not focused on ending animal suffering. People often ask me, and I know a lot of other people in the movement get asked all the time, but how do you stop a lion from killing a gazelle? That's not what we're trying to stop. We're trying to stop this human-caused suffering where we've got millions of hens in batcher cages where they don't have the room to simply turn around, where we're keeping pigs in sow stalls, where we're shooting animals from the sky, where we're logging, doing huge amounts of native forest logging and destroying natural habitat for koalas and other native animals. That's what we're focused on. And so I ended up doing my master's in health psychology and focusing on health promotion, which is a part of psychology that looks at mass behaviour change. And so it looks at how do we convince entire populations to start wearing seatbelts? How do we convince entire populations to stop smoking? And I wanted to take some of those ideas and those strategies into animal protection campaigning. And I worked for People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, I worked for World Animal Protection, I worked for Animal Liberation, and then somebody asked me, would you consider running for Parliament? And I asked the question I asked myself was, where am I best placed to help animals? And I could see that there was an amazing shift in individual change, that people were changing their behaviours, and they were turning their backs on industries that were particularly cruel to animals. And I could see that corporations were also starting to listen, and that organisations like Animals Australia, Animal Liberation, PETA, were doing great work with companies to make sure they had ethical policies in place and that they weren't funding cruel events like rodeos. And these were really successful campaigns. But then when I looked at the political sphere, I could see that, in New South Wales, we banned greyhound racing and then they overturned that ban. We had a halt on the live animal export industry federally, and not only did they reopen it, but then there was these massive campaigns to actually push to increase the live export industry from when the National Liberal government were in power. And so I could see that we were making all these changes in community and in corporate spaces, but the political world was so far behind where where the community and everyone else was, and where our science was. And so I knew that that was a space that we were going to be able to get some much bigger changes for animals if we made sure we had advocates in politics for those animals, because something desperately needed to happen in that space because there simply wasn't a voice.
I love the purring of the chicken. That's wonderful. I suppose the next question I've got is probably implicit to all that you do, but it's how can you describe some aspect of trying to make life better for real life animals in Australia?
Yeah. Look, I might sort of talk just briefly about a couple of our campaigns. I'll talk about one that we won, and then I'll talk about one that we're currently sort of in the middle of right now. So when I first got elected, one of our inquiries that we managed to get up was looking at the use of animals in entertainment. So it was looking at circuses, but also dolphins in dolphinariums. And we heard that a dolphin that is bred and born into captivity can live in captivity for up to 50 years. And that's quite sad, because I sort of think when I was younger and I didn't know what suffering those animals experienced, I actually went to a dolphinarium, and to think that the same dolphin that I saw as a child is still in that same backyard pool doing the same repetitive tricks for another group of tourists. And we also heard that the industry, that people were turning their back on going to dolphinariums, that the business model was starting to reduce. But we also heard that they were still breeding these animals. So what happens if these businesses are going to last for another 10, 20 years? What happens to all the animals that they continue to breed into captivity that can't be released into the wild, or may not be able to be released in the wild? We actually don't know. And so we really looked into that, and we ended up getting a recommendation from that inquiry, and I was quite outnumbered on that inquiry. It was myself, it was a shooters MP that was chairing that inquiry. I had Liberal Nationals, there was 3 of them, and only 2 Labor. And so we still managed to get a recommendation from that inquiry that at least that cetaceans, so dolphins, whales, cannot continue to be bred into these industries, and we cannot have them being brought from other states into New South Wales, and no new businesses being able to sort of set up basically in New South Wales. And then I took that to the Environment Minister at the time, who was quite a progressive Environment Minister, and we worked out that we could actually just change the regulations. And so he rewrote the regulations based on those inquiry recommendations, and now in New South Wales, no new facility can ever set up. So that means that if SeaWorld ever wanted to come into New South Wales, they can't possibly do so. So that's kind of the end of that industry here in New South Wales. So that was a really good win for us. On the other side of that, at the moment we're running a campaign. Again, last year we ran an inquiry and we looked into the use of animals in medical experimentation specifically, and there was 2 experiments that were highlighted as particularly problematic, and that's the forced swim and forced smoking experiments. So the forced swim tests, and I apologise, but it is quite distressing. In forced swim tests, they put animals into inescapable beakers or buckets of water, and then they're forced to try to swim until they give up and drown. And the forced smoking experiments, animals are put into plastic tubes and have cigarette smoke pumped into their nostrils for 90 minutes twice a day, for 5 days a week. And then on the weekend, because nobody's working, the animals go through withdrawal period. In the forced swim tests, what they're trying to do is test antidepressants. And so the idea is you give an animal an antidepressant and see how long they continue to try to survive. Now, obviously, an animal trying to survive has nothing to do with a chronic human condition like depression. It came up quite strongly in our inquiry from other researchers that this is not scientifically valid research. And so we got a recommendation from that inquiry that those experiments are phased out, because there's still a lot that are happening in New South Wales. We know that several universities have banned them. I found out on a call for papers that we did that Victor Chang Institute were actually doing 90-minute forced swim tests. So the ones that we heard from Wollongong University, so Wollongong actually stopped approving them because there was deaths of animals. They were 92nd for swim tests. The Victor Chang was doing 90 minutes. I did a social media post about that. They contacted me, we met with them. They now have a policy in place that they will not be, they don't have any currently running now, and they're not going to approve any into the future. So that was a good win as well. The forced smoking experiments were running for a very long time at the University of Newcastle. If the animal, while in the plastic tube, moves their head, they can asphyxiate and die. There was a huge number of deaths on the towers at Newcastle University. If they urinate at any point in time, they can also freeze afterwards because they get very cold because they couldn't move, and they're also full of so much nicotine. And so there was, just an enormous number of deaths. Again, it was highly criticised, and the reason why it was highly criticised by other researchers was because the animals are in such a state of stress and they're so unhealthy that you can't actually make sure there's not all these sort of conflicting variables involved in the research that they are doing. So we got recommendations that they both rapidly phase out. We've now written legislation and introduced that into Parliament. I have been talking with the other political parties. Labor doesn't want to have anything to do with it. But the Department of Primary Industries and the National Health and Medical Research Council are looking into it. The Animal Research Review Panel, which is part of DPI, has made a recommendation that they are phased out, which is fantastic. And we're now looking at the RSPCA New South Wales also supports legislation, and I'm now working to get the numbers without the government to get that legislation passed. So fingers crossed. We'll be able to get that very soon. Thank you. We do get some unusual support. To give you an idea, over the last term of Parliament, for me to pass anything in the upper house, I had to get Labor on side, the Greens on side, Independent Justin Field, who was progressive and a former Green, on side, and then I had to get one more vote. And my choices were One Nation, the Shooters and Fishers Party, or Fred Nile from the Christian Democrats Party. So, what was really interesting though is that at one point I put up a motion condemning the fur industry, and Fred, who always voted with the government, crossed the floor and voted with us. And so I started talking with him quite a lot more. He ended up supporting us against the Koala kill bill. He supported us very strongly on our puppy farm legislation. That's how we ended up. We didn't get it passed in both houses, but we got it passed in the upper house with Fred Nile's support. And we even managed to start talking to him about some other issues even outside of animals. He voted for LGBTQI rights for disabled people. And when he voted for that, he turned to myself and Mark Pearson at the time and said, I'm following what you guys do. So, we're able to then build some of these connections and make sure that we're working with everyone in Parliament. Now, in this term of Parliament, I can either get Labor, the Greens, the Cannabis Party and myself, and I've got the numbers. He's quite progressive. He's also a former Green. However, Labor, now that they're in government, is less willing to work with us than they were in the last term. So if I go the other side and I get the coalition, then I need to get the Greens, the Cannabis Party and one other. Again, so I've got two former One Nations, a new One Nation person who was a Labor, and I've also still got the two Shooters Party people to work with. And we've also now got a Liberal Democrat member who's quite open to work on animal issues as well. So we have to end up working with a whole range of different people to try to get progress through.
Thank you.
Okay, hang on. I'm going to jump on in here. For those I'm not really part of this world. I'm a political scientist, but I was really curious about the interplay between animals and politics. And you're part of the Animal Justice Party, a minor party. I'm just really curious, like, who's voting for the Animal Justice Party? Do you get like all the cat people and the dog people don't want a bar of you? Like, what's the voter base of the Animal Justice Party looking like?
It's interesting because when we look at our votes and where we're achieving our votes, we don't do very well in the more progressive seats. So we don't do well around Newtown, for example. Where we do well is Western Sydney, so areas like Penrith. We do well in Camden, we do well in Mount Druitt. In fact, we've got a councillor in Campbelltown because we do very well, and that vote has continued to increase in those spaces as well. We also do well where the Greens don't tend to do well, so we do quite well in Cessnock. I think we have actually outvoted the Greens quite a few times in Cessnock in the lower house. And of course, a lot of our focus is on the upper house votes because that's where we actually get elected as well. And obviously, anybody right across New South Wales can vote for us in the upper house. But it's important for us to put candidates in some of those lower house seats where we've got those really strong votes.
Yeah, so interesting because when I hear animal justice, I sort of think progressive side of politics. Broad generalisations, but they're probably, vegan, very progressive, they're voting animal justice, but to hear that's like sort of from outside those areas is just really interesting.
I think it's a lot of families. I think it's a lot of families who have a yard, who have a companion animal, and I think it's a lot of people as well who are looking at the two major parties and they're disappointed by both of them, and they're looking for an alternative. And they look at some of the alternatives and they think, well, we love our dog, we want more dog parks, we want, we want to make sure these animals are protected. We also get a very significant second preference vote as well, so where people vote for one of the major parties and then put us too. And if they meet a quota, or if they don't meet a quota on their next vote, and people have put us too, then we get that vote as well. And so we pick up a lot from there.
Yeah, so cool. And the other thing I wanted to know, so I'm from Melbourne, so like you said a lot of places. I'm like, those are places, sure. But
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I know my geography a little bit, but I was just really curious because like some of the things that have come out for me that have been really seismic in New South Wales politics. You've alluded to the greyhound racing ban, which was a backflip and then actually led to like the shooters winning a by-election and caused the national MP, the leader at the time, to resign. That's how Barilaro came in. So greyhound racing caused Barilaro, which is good or bad, but. The other thing I was really interested in is the koala killing bills, with John Barilaro threatening to blow up the coalition over it, which, for those who are unaware, the Liberal National Coalition in New South Wales is the only coalition across the country that's never dissolved in any meaningful way. Every other state there's been schisms, fights, reforms, mergers, but it's the only coalition that has never dissolved in any meaningful way. And they're going to do it over koalas. So I just was really curious to know a little bit about sort of like how the animal justice, tell me a bit about that and how animal justice, what your role was there.
Absolutely. We were both in Parliament when the koala wars were happening, and I think it's important as well to recognise that, and other people, sort of some of our clerks and departments have highlighted to us how much more animals are mentioned since the Animal Justice Party have been elected. Before it was just kind of something pushed to the side and it wasn't something that was really properly discussed through Parliament. And so I think us being in there and then obviously having the opposite to us with the Shooters Party, but still actually managing to drive legislation through. I mean, we passed more private members' bills than any other member of Parliament. And so we were really getting through changes and amendments. And so suddenly people realised that they needed to actually start talking about animal issues. And then there was this huge division on the koala bill. And a lot of that as well came from the fact that because there'd been so much discussion and we had really elevated the importance of animals in Parliament, one of the Liberal MPs, Catherine Cusack, was threatening to cross the floor if they put the koala bill up. So she lived up in northern New South Wales where there were populations of koalas where her community really wanted to make sure koalas were being protected. And this bill was absolutely atrocious. It was going to allow, the cutting down of so much koala habitat. We would have seen the absolute extinction of koalas, and I'm still really concerned. Even though we've got a Labor government now that's talking about a Great Koala National Park. At the moment, they've only committed to 5% of the Great Koala National Park. But it was, and I'm not surprised, it's an animal issue that's actually rocking the boat within that coalition, because every time we've spoken with the Liberals, they've been somewhat open to the changes, like, ending puppy farming. Obviously it was the Liberal Party who put up an end to greyhound racing. So the Liberal Party themselves aren't necessarily against some of those welfare changes for animals. But then, they've created this coalition with the National Party, who are really a minor party, that have managed to get themselves into government and to have this huge influence. And we can see how much influence they have when you just look at how animal protection has actually been set up to fail. And when you talk with the Liberals, they don't want to sort of touch animal issues because, it's almost like the National Party owns it. But we've got an agriculture minister overseeing our animal protection laws.
Yeah.
With a massive conflict of interest, because they're there to protect industry, and you've got the Department of Primary Industries there advocating for what industry want, and industry doesn't want to improve welfare. So it's that massive conflict. And then, of course, we've got animal welfare laws, which are so outdated. They were written in 1979, the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. It's proving nearly impossible to get an update of those laws and to get any progressive changes through there, but again, because there's this block. And that legislation is the only piece of criminal legislation that requires a private charity to fundraise from the public to be able to uphold those laws. And when you think about how ridiculous that is, it would be like getting the police to do a fun run to raise money to investigate drink driving, for example. But that's how we set up our animal protection laws. And again, it all comes down to that coalition and sort of pushing animal welfare out of the political space so that, the whole system's been set up to fail animals, and it has been.
Very good stuff. I'll move on.
It's late in the day, so I've forgotten if we already did introductions or not. And just in case we didn't, I'm Josh Holloway. I'm a lecturer in government. We didn't? No, that's okay. Sadly, for everyone, me being a lecturer in government means it's going to be more political science questions. I did a little bit of homework before coming onto the panel so as not to embarrass myself, and did a bit of literature review on animal justice parties, generally speaking. And there's a lot of focus on the party as part of a party family. So taking into consideration the Dutch, arguably the most successful party around animal rights and animal welfare, German, French, Portuguese as well. That study this one that looked at the party family, located the Australian iteration of the Animal Justice Party as the only party with an exclusive focus on animals in their policy platform. Now, I think that study was a bit of a product of its time, even though it was only about 6 years old. Looking at the policy platforms of the AJP now, it's far more comprehensive. So my questions kind of sit within that space of policy and ideology, and my first one is around, could you walk us through how a political party that was, at least in its earlier days, almost exclusively focused on animals, comes to adopt policies on economic management, industrial relations, on technological advancement, on infrastructure?
Absolutely. So I guess a little bit of history probably for the Animal Justice Party in Australia is probably worthwhile. We were founded in 2009, and we got somebody elected in 2015. So it's almost unheard of that a political party starts developing and gets someone elected that quickly. And in the next election after that, 4 years later, I got elected. But we also got somebody a few months before me elected in Victoria. So suddenly we've got this political party that has grown very, very quickly. And so we'd only started writing the policies. And so I think that, and we're still writing policies because there's so many policies you can write about. And certainly, as we go to the elections now, our voters want to know where we stand on issues that are really important to them. And so while we started on that animal platform, which was so important as our base, we've expanded simply because we've grown so quickly as a party. And I think that we probably would have gone down that route anyway. It was just that we had to sort of very suddenly grow into it. But I think it also, it does sort of, as a party, you need to grow into this, like it's beyond sort of just talking to people about how you would vote on issues. It's also about showing where you stand on things. And also, as we grow as a party, you need to make sure that representatives of that party understand where, like, we will sit on all of those issues as well when we go to elections. It's always important for us to have as many lower house candidates as possible, so having as much policies and guidance already put in place as to where we stand on certain issues really helps them as well.
Figuring out where you stand as particularly a new political party is, I think, a challenge that all political parties go through, but some other parties, for instance, say if you look at Labor, has long-standing traditions that they can draw on in terms of social liberalism, social democracy, socialism. The Greens, for instance, eco-socialism, green social democracy. What are the kind of like underpinning anchors in terms of ideas, ideologies that animal justice can call on? Is it, the research tends to suggest or put a label on it as an animalist kind of ideology. Is that kind of appropriate? And if it is, how do you latch on things like industrial relations or people-focused policies? I think you refer to it in the policy platform. Does that fit in an animalist framework?
A little bit, yes. There was another thing I was going to say, and I can't remember what it was that you touched on, but I was going to say something. But what I'll say first is that when I first got elected, I think to make sure that people really took us seriously, we did start to talk about that real one welfare framework. And we really started to highlight that. So when we talk about a one welfare framework, we're talking about the fact that, people, animals and the environment are all together and we all rely on each other and we're all interconnected. And so some of the early work that we were doing was, and particularly for me, as I had my background as a psychologist, I was talking about, one of the campaigns we had was increasing the penalties for animal cruelty. And so a lot of my argument there was, we know from the research that people who harm animals also harm people, that violence is violence and it doesn't just exist in this one sphere. And so where we've got penalties for animal cruelty that are so incredibly low, we're not actually recognising how serious this crime is also for communities, and how that person could be dangerous for people as well. We also looked at the link around domestic violence and animal abuse. So 70% of people stay in violent situations because they cannot live with their animals, because the system hasn't been set up to allow them to live with animals. And they won't leave animals behind because they know those animals will be killed or they'll be used as a form of coercive control. So we changed the domestic violence legislation to recognise the link between domestic violence and animal abuse. We made sure animals were included in the coercive control legislation that was brought into New South Wales. We had money and funding put directly towards refuge services so that they could build shelters that were suitable for animals for people who were escaping violence at that particular time. And we also had animals included on apprehended domestic violence orders. And then following that, we also worked on the working with children's check system. So people who had been charged with grotesque animal cruelty were being able to pass a working with children's check. Now, nobody would want somebody who had been convicted of a serious offence of animal cruelty then going and working in the childcare centre with their daughter or niece or nephew or anyone. And so we changed the working with children's check system so that you could not pass a working with children's check system on those higher level animal cruelty offences, and the lower level cruelty offences were at least trigger offences to the children's guardian so they could actually review that. So actually we've changed some of that narrative within Parliament by starting on some of that work to get people to realise that there is that interconnectedness. But I do think it is somewhat both. Like, there's obviously going to be things that don't have a really strong animal link, but as a party that's growing, I think we need to recognise all of that And I think that's why, some of our policies will be human focused, because I think particularly, as we've got an upper house and a lower house, if we're a political party that wants to eventually grow into the space of being able to get somebody elected in the lower house, we need to be able to ensure that we've covered all those areas as well.
Just add one last question, and you've given a perfect segue to it in mentioning interconnectedness, and in reading the kind of impetus behind the party and the philosophical kind of foundations of the policy platform. In addition to interconnectedness, you mentioned the intrinsic value of non-human animals and of nature as well. And in some ways, there's a bit of overlap there with the Greens in terms of their philosophical underpinnings. But in applying that intrinsic value of non-human animals and interconnectedness, applying that across the way that we organise our economies, our societies, our politics, it means a fundamental kind of revolution in the way that we almost do everything. Do you think there's a hard cap on the number of people, the proportion of Australians that can get on board with that? We've already seen the Greens kind of peter out at around between 10 to 15%, with some discrepancies in certain electorates. But do you think there is a limit to how many people you can reach?
I don't think that there is a limit. I think that as we continue to grow, and I can already see this rural society shift, I think it's at these really early stages, and so people are somewhat unsure where it will go, but I think we've got to go one way or the other. We did see a significant increase in the vote for the Greens federally. We did see a drop in New South Wales, but the Animal Justice Party continued to grow. So even though we didn't get another member elected at the last election, our vote actually still significantly increased. And I think that as a society, we kind of need to go one way or the other. And it links in again to this whole one welfare and the interconnectedness, because when you think about the fact that, climate change and climate disasters will increase, and I think that's why we're seeing an increase in the votes for the Greens. We need to dramatically change focus, and we need to dramatically shift gears. The major parties are all focused on industries and supporting economy over and above supporting the environment, supporting animals, and then in turn supporting future generations. And I think that's going to be a big shift as well when we get more young people who are of voting age, and as they more of them become voters when they hit 18, I think we're going to see a bigger and bigger shift in that voting, because they don't see let's keep these coal mines open. What they see is, hang on, we need to organise just transitions for those workers. Yes, there's good, strong support for that, but they don't want to keep the coal mines open. And at the same time, and I guess where we're different from the Greens, is that we really focus on animal agribusiness and the impact of animal agribusiness on the climate emergency, which nobody else is talking about in Parliament, and the massive amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. We've got a net zero bill from the Labor Party that doesn't even mention or recognise that animals exist at all, that they are impacted by climate change, or that, by not looking after the animals, that we're actually causing climate change as well. And we're the only political party actually there sort of talking about ideas like transformation. We did an inquiry into the dairy industry recently, and I got a recommendation in that inquiry that we should actually be working because the dairy industry were asking for more subsidies because less and less people are consuming dairy products. So they wanted more of our taxpayer money to prop up their industry while they try to rebuild their customer base and get more people consuming dairy products. But our argument was, well, actually, why don't we help dairy farmers to actually transition out of the industry and instead use those subsidies to actually help farmers to transition into some kind of plant-based agriculture, if that's where diets are moving towards. So we're the only ones that are talking about that whole aspect of it. And I think as those ideas grow, our vote will grow as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for all the information so far, Emma. It's just so interesting. To provide a bit of background on my questions for everyone, I'm an anthropologist and I'm working across the spaces of greyhound rescue and greyhound racing and all the spaces in between of people who share their lives with greyhounds. So for my questions for Emma, I tried to look at the two poles of the people I work with and think, okay, what sort of questions would maybe they want me to ask. So I'll start with rescue, and that's that many people involved in rescue, specifically women, feel that a lot of the hard work and effort that they put into animal advocacy is equated with, well, they've been brought there by their emotions and by their love and care for animals, but that they are quite powerless in the greyhound rescue and racing debate, and that a lot of the time these more powerful voices use that equation of animal advocacy with this notion of hysterical women and irrationality to sort of invalidate their arguments that they feel are actually really strong, great arguments, but they're just straight away before they can gain any traction pushed under the rug. So I was wondering, as a woman in your position, do you see similarities between yourself and these people that I work with in rescue? And if so, what kind of advice would you give to these people, particularly the women who feel so disempowered in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right, I think it's beyond rescue. And I will also highlight that, there's so many women in rescue, and of course this is, again, unpaid work. It's, we see it everywhere. And I think it's actually the whole progressive movement. The perfect picture of this is just to look at the crossbench in New South Wales Parliament. Is on the right, we've got 2 male shooters party MPs. We've got 2 former male One Nation MPs. We've got 1 Liberal Democrat male MP. And we've got 1 female One Nation MP. And then on the left side, so the progressive side of Parliament, we've got 4 Greens MPs who are all female, myself, who's female with the Animal Justice Party, and we've got 1 male, the Legalised Cannabis Party MP. So we've got 5 males and 1 female on the hard right, and we've got 5 females and 1 male on the progressive end. And we notice it when we're sitting, because you actually sit on different sides of Parliament and you just see them there and us here. And so you have that real visual of exactly what you're saying. In regards to sort of feeling quite disempowered by this, something that happened the other day when we were talking about climate change, and there was a climate debate, and a couple of men on the hard right were talking about, basically they were climate deniers, and so they were giving their speeches about how it's not really happening and it's all just a sham. And everybody else in the house was sort of rolling their eyes, ignoring them, heckling them a little bit. But it became clear to me that they were the minority argument now. And I thought, prior to my being elected, the Greens had probably gone up and put up the argument, and they were the minority for the environment. And yet that has quickly changed to the majority recognising that this is not, I'm not saying that enough is being done, but there's at least we've gotten to that point where the narrative has changed, where people recognise that this is an emergency and things need to happen. And I think that we're several paces behind on animal protection. But I was sitting there during that debate thinking, it's like I'm the minority now talking about the animals, but that's going to shift. And that's part of the reason why it was so important for the Animal Justice Party to get elected into Parliament, to actually begin those conversations. And then when it shifts, there'll just be a small minority sort of talking, I think, on the other side and defending it.
Yeah, that's really cool. So now to go to the other side. So contrary to feeling as though they do hold any power in the racing and rescue debate, the people that I've worked with from racing They say that they feel that they actually don't have any power either, and that they're all characterised as being stupid bogans, and that it's very classist and etc. So, while my research has shown that the class backgrounds of those involved in greyhound racing does actually range from high to low, and this is what has been said to me by people in racing and rescue, the people that I've worked with are really adamant that their sport is targeted because of this overriding idea that those who race greyhounds are predominantly working class and therefore stupid and not worthwhile. So I thought it would be interesting to hear you, personally discuss who it is you are thinking of and envisioning when you are talking about greyhound racing.
Yeah, thank you. My understanding is that the real strength of that argument came in during the New South Wales ban. My understanding is that a lot of people, well, I guess the people who were employed by industries and lobby groups were actually pushing that and turning it into a class war. So it moved away from being an animal welfare war, which they couldn't win, and became about a class war. And so that was really heavily pushed by industry. I don't think it was the animal protection movement ever pushing that narrative, and I've never heard it being pushed in that way. And so I agree with you that it is a broad range of people that are involved in this industry. Certainly there are politicians in New South Wales Parliament who have racing greyhounds, and they're not struggling paycheck to paycheck. So it's, as you say, I mean, it's an interesting one because it is something to challenge, and obviously there was enough money within this industry to really hire lobbyists and hire people and to really significantly change the messaging through the media and the narrative through the media. And it has probably stuck. And it probably has stuck to people who are working in that industry who had nothing to do with those campaigns. But yeah, it was definitely a narrative that was just so strongly pushed by industry itself.
Yeah, thank you for that. I feel like it's really great to hear you personally underlining those points.
Yeah. Earlier you talked about the link between human and animal abuse, and I was really glad to hear you mention that link, and not just about domestic violence but also about working for children checks and so forth. I want to touch on something that's a bit more controversial than that, because I think it's more comfortable for the general public to see weirdo perverts in that way around doing harm to animals. But actually, if we look at the scale of animal abuse, particularly in animal agriculture, they're not weirdo perverts, are they? They're regular people. Or put it this way, they're not seen as that. So if you could just give us a comment on perhaps the scale of the challenge to try and challenge that kind of sexual exploitation of animals in animal agriculture.
Yeah, it's it is an interesting one. It was something I brought up recently in budget estimates to the Minister for Agriculture in New South Wales, was the fact that turkeys are bred to grow so big that they cannot naturally procreate. They can't stand most of the time. So they're actually hand masturbated in the industry, and the females are artificially inseminated by the semen that's collected. So I'm always bringing it up in Parliament, and there is this reaction. Every Christmas I talk about it because I remind everyone before they go and get a turkey. And there's sort of just like this sort of childish reaction to it because they're not quite sure how to respond to it. In fact, somebody brought to my attention that one of the Shooters Party MPs, when I was questioning the minister about it, because there's been this whole national standards and guidelines process that recognised the hand masturbation of turkeys and made some recommendations, and she said she wasn't going to bring in regulations or legislation into New South Wales, which meant that any welfare changes around that would also not be in New South Wales, which means there'd be laws all around the country except in our state And first of all, she had, like, the minister had no idea what I was talking about. She said she didn't know enough about the turkey industry to know what was actually happening. But one of the Shooters MPs got the video of it and put it up, sort of making a joke out of it, but because he couldn't quite understand. He was like, oh, she's focused on this, like there's something wrong with me by bringing it up. And I'm like, well, no, we're bringing it up because it's a problem.
So he was trying to slut shame you, as though you were sexual for raising his...
Well, I think he was trying to sort of say, like, oh, how odd and stupid that, you know, we're asking all these serious questions and she brings this up. But it actually sort of, I think he was kind of, it's almost like gaslighting, like trying to sort of make out, like, oh, isn't she weird because, like, she's talking about this, not recognising actually the weird thing is what's actually happening in these industries that isn't actually being discussed. And look, I think that it's a difficult one to communicate, and I think sometimes the best way to communicate it is to really talk about the experience of these animals. So when you start talking about, and I often talk about it as the animal agribusiness industry, because I also know, and having spoken to people who are involved in these industries, a lot of them actually hate it, and they're doing it because that's the only job they've been given, or that's the only thing that they think that they can do. And of course, they're getting these huge pressure from major corporations that are saying, no, you know, you need to squeeze as many hens as you can into those broiler sheds. You need to do this. You need to pump them full of these antibiotics so they survive in these conditions. So, you know, they're being instructed on what to do. And if they try to change that, then they're not going to make enough money to survive. So when what we're tackling is not an individual and their behaviour, what we're tackling is an industry. We're tackling the animal agribusiness industry, and these people who are making millions of money, rather than focusing on the person on the ground that's actually sort of being pushed into this.
Because there seems to be, I just say this response and hand it on in case someone wants another question, or someone from the audience. There seems to be this assumption that if you're not deriving sexual pleasure from the activity, then it's not sexual exploitation or sexual abuse. I don't think it actually matters to a victim whether it's a human animal or non-human animal when they're being exploited, whether, to put it frankly, you're getting your rocks off. I don't think it matters to them. I think it's the invasion of their bodies. So I just was really, I'm heartened to hear that you raise it, because people will often shout you down from even talking about this. They can't, that childish reaction. Don't tell me, I can't handle it.
Yeah. And I think it also goes in, that same response happens when you actually talk about the sexual abuse of animals generally. You know, we've changed a lot of the laws in New South Wales, and it was even hard to get media because some of the journalists didn't want to write about, you know, the actual sexual abuse of animals. We now have the strongest laws around bestiality in New South Wales, and we're starting a national campaign. An article actually just came out just before I stepped in, because we're now the only state in Australia that has automatic lifetime bans for anybody that's been convicted of bestiality. And there's more bestiality charges than I think most people realise. We looked into it, and it's a very hard crime to discover. It's a very hard crime to investigate. You know, the victims can't give testimony, so it's very hard to find these cases. There are about 7 just in New South Wales every year. Which I think is more than what most people would expect.
And that's not including the industry.
Yeah,
That's
not
your
including
individual.
industry.
Yeah, that's
I'm
right.
talking about,
It's
I'm
much worse than that, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm talking about the undercover sexual, where somebody is getting their rocks off, as you say. But yeah, once you start to look into industry, it's just, yeah.
Thank you so much for all that you've covered. It's wonderful. And I am going a bit backwards in what you were saying, but you were talking about, I'm not from Sydney either. I don't really know what the areas are that you're talking about. I'm originally from Melbourne, but I actually live in the Northern Rivers now. So I guess I'm also curious about, you know, how is the Animal Justice Party polling outside the capital city?
Yeah, we are polling quite well. So yes, Cessnock is outside of Sydney. So when we talk about Sydney, it's kind of those western suburbs. We do fairly well, in the Northern Rivers space, even though it is more progressive. It's kind of split between two, I guess, in your area of the world. But we do quite well in areas like Wollongong, which is south of Sydney. We do well in the Blue Mountains, which is just outside of Sydney, and then Cessnock. But I think for us as a small party, it's also a challenge for us to find representatives in those places, to make sure we find someone that can stand and actually represent the Animal Justice Party, and then obviously to get enough volunteers. What we do find is that if we have people handing out flyers at a school, we can actually double our vote from having somebody there. And we've been able to compare the same electorate, one school in location A, down the road, location B. There's a volunteer here, but there isn't a volunteer at school B. And yeah, it literally doubles our vote having somebody handing out those flyers. So I think for us, that's one of the biggest challenges with some of these more regional and rural areas as well, to be able to increase our vote.
Like visibility, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%.
Our friends are handing them out. In
Yeah,
groups.
good.
You mentioned that you had some alliances with unexpected parties, and in those, can you hear me? So you had some alliances with unexpected parties, and I was curious if those alliances are more aligned with kind of the charismatic animals. So you mentioned the koala, racing dogs, things like that, but then when they didn't support, it was related to avians. And I'm coming at this as a person who specifically researches avian species, and I put a lot of effort into the industrialized ones, so that's kind of my point of view. But I'm just curious if there's an alignment that follows the kind of charismatic nature.
It's definitely easier to get politicians across the line on issues that pertain specifically to dogs, for example. I know when we put up I had a bill called the Right to Release Bill, and that came from my background I ran a rescue organisation for animals that had been used in medical experimentation, and I couldn't get cats and dogs out of medical experimentation. I knew they were there, but the researchers didn't want to release them because they knew that there would be community uproar that they were being used in medical experimentation. So they were either recycled continually through projects and kept by the research facility or killed. So I passed a bill that made it mandatory that the animals were rehomed if they weren't suffering lifetime illnesses after the experimentation. I will say, of course, that the Animal Justice Party wants to see all experimentation phased out on animals, but that was something that we saw that was winnable. The night of my inaugural speech, we got the first dog out of a medical experimentation facility. His name was Buddy, and he was actually adopted by a member of the Liberal Party who was quite heavily involved with the Liberal Party, but she brought Buddy into Parliament. We got special permission to bring him in. I put out an email to everybody, and politicians from all the different political parties came to my office to meet Buddy because there was a dog in Parliament. And the next day we brought the legislation on, and we got significant support for that. It does become harder once you start to talk, particularly when it doesn't become harder, say, if I was going to the Greens about avian species, or the Progressives. You know, if I go to the Cannabis Party, I could probably still get him on side. It becomes more difficult when I'm relying on right-wing voters to actually support it. That's when it becomes more difficult. And there is sort of like a hierarchy almost of animals within what other people will support. And down the bottom is farmed animals, and below that is introduced species. So they are the hardest animals to bring in protections for. Having said that, with my forced swim and forced smoking experiments, we are talking about predominantly mice and rats, and quite a few people on the crossbench and the right crossbench are supporting the legislation. So there's some hope, but it's step by step.
With usual areas of support, you've mentioned the progressive kind of side of politics a lot. One of the things I was thinking about in response to that is the kind of occasional instrumental care that far-right groups have with animal welfare. And I'm thinking the particular instances where they will use animal rights in a way that's enmeshed with nationalism or nativism or, really quite abhorrent racial politics. So issues around halal or live export or whatever else. Have you, with your work in the Animal Justice Party, come across that kind of support? And thinking about the broader movement of improving and enhancing animal rights, generally speaking, how do you think the movement should manage some unhelpful and kind of controversial support that you get on certain issues?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Probably the example that comes to mind is the Brumbies at Kosciuszko National Park. So the Animal Justice Party doesn't support lethal management controls of any species of animals. And there's actually a lot of science behind it being very problematic to actually significantly reduce the number of introduced species into any one area without actually understanding or knowing what the impact of that will be. We've seen that where they've significantly reduced the number of cats in a certain area to try to save some native birds. The rat population boomed, ate all the eggs, and those birds are now extinct. So we look at it from that sort of science perspective. We also look at it from an animal cruelty perspective, and we look into non-lethal means where it's necessary. And for each species, that can be quite different. So we're very supportive of trap, neuter, release programs to significantly reduce the number of homeless cats. We also want to see government funding for desexing of domestic cats, particularly in lower income areas where people can't afford to have their cats desexed. We know that that's why we have so many cats that are entering the shelter system. In regards to Brumbies, our first position actually on the Brumby issue was around immunocontraceptive darting, which the US have used successfully for over a decade at having complete control over how many horses were in any one particular area. So we're now down to a process where there's an oocyte growth factor dart. One dart can make a female horse infertile, and there's no welfare impacts if they accidentally dart a male. Some of the older darts, it did affect the male. He would lose his harem, so there was kind of this welfare impact for the males. That doesn't exist anymore. So this is a one dart process. The female for life can't give birth. There has been, interestingly, with the debate around the Brumbies, some very serious questions around how many Brumbies there actually are and whether there's been any research into the impact they are actually causing at Kosciuszko National Park, particularly in comparison to all the developments that have been allowed in Kosciuszko National Park. And I went there myself, and I think that there is a lot of evidence behind a big question mark around the counting of those horses. It's the same process they use for the kangaroos, and we've had statisticians come in and look at it, and they say that actually the model that's being used is incorrect. And to give you a couple of examples, just because when I first heard this, I sort of thought, oh, maybe it's a bit of a conspiracy theory, it's a bit too convenient. But to give you an example, they went up into the helicopter, tried to count the number of horses that were in one area, because they count one area and then times it by other areas. And they include waterways and all these other areas where there aren't animals, so they're always going to get an overestimation. But they didn't count enough horses in that area to be able to apply it to the statistical model. So they just used the old data from like 2017 or something and put that many horses in. And so there's some really dodgy stuff happening with the statistics. So, our position was there needs to be a proper recount. There needs to be independent oversight of that recount, and we need to be using the methodology that's used elsewhere. We're the only ones that are using this really strange methodology that significantly overestimates how many animals there are. And then, of course, we need to actually understand what damage those animals are doing. But sorry, going back to your question, yes, we've suddenly got, the National Party that wants to support this as well. And I don't think the intentions are the same. And it's interesting when it has come up for debate in Parliament, because I'm the only progressive person that's getting up and actually speaking up on the welfare impacts of aerial shooting, which is what the government has proposed. I'm the only one talking about non-lethal methods if it's needed. And that has actually been called out, that there is a recognition that we've got a consistent view, because we're not just talking about horses, we're also talking about the same thing for cats, for pigs, for deer, whereas the other parties are just talking about horses. How to actually deal with that? I'm not sure. I think it's sort of like a case-by-case basis, really, and seeing if those sorts of, there are often times where the other side will agree with you, and it's probably a good opportunity to work with them when you can, if it could potentially lead to something. Another example is the undergrounding of power lines, which I was on an inquiry, and the National Party again agreed with both us and the Greens that we should be undergrounding those power lines. Having them above head had so many issues, and one of those issues just being the difficulty for firefighters to even access people's properties if they have overhead electricity power lines, and that they simply can't, because they can't come in with a helicopter and come down low enough if there's those lines there, which means that people could just potentially lose their property. So there was this unholy alliance, but sometimes it can work. And I think sometimes it's great when we get them on our side. We recently had the government put shark nets back in. And I ran a press conference, and we had Alex Greenwich, who's an independent in the lower house. We had Michael Regan, another independent, both progressive. We had Greens, we had cannabis. But I also had two MPs from the Liberal Party come along, including the former Environment Minister. And again, we had the Liberal Democrat come along. And suddenly the media interest in this, because there was sort of this coalition of MPs. It wasn't just like the progressive versus the government, or it was actually this whole range of MPs that were willing to say, no, we need to get shark nets out because it's causing this incredible damage to and harm to animals. And I think sometimes it can work. It's a difficult one though.
Thank you. So, I don't know if you maybe want to provide a little bit of background for what I'm about to say, because you could probably explain it better than me. But I've been following that you did some teaming up with Georgie Purcell and the great work that you guys did with the kangaroo issue and going over to America. And I was just curious, is that sort of a standard sort of route to tackle that kind of an issue, or was that a complete, innovative, let's try this way of dealing with this issue?
Yeah, it was definitely a planned strategy. So it was interesting, actually. I was talking with a Canadian MP who was vegan, and he was talking about trying to stop the seal clubbing industry. And he showed me the debates that he was having in Parliament, and you could actually take the arguments and switch seal clubbing with kangaroos. It was exactly the same argument that is put here in Australia. And it's interesting when you try to talk within a country about something that is uniquely happening in a country, a lot of people don't want to hear about it, or don't want to know, or don't believe it. In our code of practice, it actually requires the hunter to actually take a joey out of the mother's pouch and hit their head against the truck with blunt force trauma. And that's how they kill them, and that's why we make that connection with the seal clubbing industry. And yet this industry is way bigger than seal clubbing. You talk to any Australian about seal clubbing and they talk about how horrific it is and how against it they are. But you talk to them about what happens to joeys, and even though people are horrified and disgusted, most of them haven't heard of it before. And our government is always looking after industry. And actually we saw that even more when we went to the US, because a lot of the politicians that we spoke to, all the legislators that we spoke to, the Congress people we spoke to in the US, were all talking about the fact that the Australian Congress was also then coming, and when we met with a legislator in New York who wanted to put legislation up to ban the sale of kangaroo body parts in New York, she was immediately contacted by the Australian consulate, who were campaigning to get her to change her mind. And so there's this real push that they are there to protect industry, not protect our native animals. So we went to the US, we met with New York, but we also met federally with various Congress people. There's now a federal bill that is co-sponsored by Jan Schakowsky from the Democrats and Brian Fitzgerald from the Republicans. So it's going to be a bill that's supported by both parties. We're going to try to get 21 co-sponsors onto that bill, and that will be right across America to actually stop the import of kangaroo parts. And when we were over in the US, it was amazing the response that we got, and we got it from both sides of politics as well. Whoever we were meeting with, they were absolutely horrified to hear that this is the largest land-based massacre of wildlife in the world. That in America, they don't actually have any wildlife trade. They don't trade their wildlife. Whereas in Australia, we are huge for trading our wildlife. And many years ago, when we were trading koala parts, the US put up a bill and banned the importation of koala parts. Now, if they hadn't had done that, would we be much closer to having koalas extinct in Australia? We probably would have. So it required that real global spotlight on what we were doing to koalas before the wildlife trade of koalas stopped. And now we need to do the same thing with kangaroos. There's pressure as well from Europe and other places around the world as well. The protests that are happening, there's actually a worldwide protest this weekend on the massacre of kangaroos in Australia. And I think there was 7 countries in Europe were having protests. There's a couple in the US as well, and there's one in Sydney as well at the Adidas store. And so there's this real spotlight now on Australia, and I think that that's sometimes the only way you can actually get progress when the government wants to protect industry.
Yeah. Wow, thanks so much. Yeah, that's so interesting.
We can close up sooner than we thought, but what I will do is a very belated introduction. So what we're going to do is we're going to go around, because I only thought to introduce Emma. Sorry, I've been chairing all day. I'm a little bit delirious, so apologies.
I've been in a workshop, so I'm also like, oh.
So I'm going to pass it around, and I'm going to get you to say 3 key things about yourself, because we are going to be on.
We'll start from left to right. Ladies first.
So I'm Justine Groizard. I'm from the University of Newcastle. I'm a very, very recently submitted PhD student as of 2 weeks ago. Thank you. I look at the very contested domain that is greyhound racing, greyhound rescue, and all the people that I have coined in my research as greyhound oriented in between, and I look at I'm going on too long, sorry, but what constitutes love and what those different kinds of loves mean for the dogs.
I'm Josh Holloway. I'm a lecturer in government at Flinders University. My usual research areas around democratic stability and resilience, comparative party politics, with a particular focus on small parties, green parties, and now animal rights parties, apparently. At least that's a new research area. I'm very happy to be here at the Animal Studies Conference, although it's been a very long day, so I think I'm keeping, the longer I speak, the more I'm keeping you guys away from your beers, or at least that's the way that I'm thinking I'm looking to go get a drink, so I might pass it on to Todd.
So my name's Todd Farrell. I'm a casual teaching associate at the University of Melbourne, like full-time teaching. Before this, I'd marked like 160 third-year undergraduate essays and then had to do research. I'm very similar to Josh. I'm really interested in like sort of minor parties, sort of at the sub-national level, so that's like state and territory. Also really keen on voting behaviour, so sort of like, I like to call it the rats and stats of politics, although that's probably in poor taste given I said it and I'm like, oh no.
It's not the right group.
It's really not. But yeah, I don't know, the more statistical elements of it. So yeah, I'm just going to pass swiftly right along.
Thanks, Todd. And I'm Heather Fraser. I'm an associate professor in social work at QUT in Brisbane, and good to see Fiona here, who's another social worker, I think. No? If there is a social worker, please let me know. So we're a real mix of disciplines, and we were really keen to be able to capture this session, weren't we, for other people's benefit. So any other last questions or comments? It was wonderful, wasn't it? It was a great session. Thank you.
Yeah.